Judge Kincaid thought he was sentencing a clueless teenager, right up until the moment the defendant started dismantling the case piece by piece like a veteran attorney who knew exactly where every bolt was hidden and how every lever worked. The courthouse felt like it was holding its breath. The benches were crowded, the air stale with coffee and nerves, the kind of quiet that comes right before thunder. At the defense table, the chair looked a size too big for the young man standing beside it. He wasn't slouching, wasn't posturing, just steady, as if his pulse had chosen its pace and refused to speed up for anyone. His name was Orion Vale, 19. The charges on the docket were grand theft auto and resisting arrest. The file was thick enough to sound official when dropped on a desk. The whispering in the gallery had already tried and convicted him. In their minds, the story was simple. A stolen Audi, a chase through downtown, a teenager in sneakers, and a hoodie who ran when the blue lights came alive. Simple stories are dangerous when people are tired. Judge Alistair Kincaid peered over the rim of his glasses with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He had the look of a man who managed calendars and reputations more than he wrestled with doubt. "Mr. Vale," he said, voice smooth with the confidence of 1,000 mornings like this one. "This isn't a classroom debate. Let's not waste the court's time." A handful of people chuckled. The prosecutor, Damon LeClaire, straightened his already straight tie and allowed himself the tiniest smirk, the kind worn by someone who has practiced winning in the mirror. The court reporter, Ms. Park, stared at her machine like it might save her from boredom. The bailiff, Deputy Collins, shifted his weight, waiting for the dull, inevitable end. It would have been easy to play along. Plead, agree, apologize for the inconvenience, promise to do better. It would have been easy to feed the machine and let it burp out a sentence. Orion didn't do easy. He knew courtrooms the way other kids knew basketball courts. His mother, Marisol Vale, had been a paralegal for 20 years, long enough to recognize every trick and shortcut people tried to pass off as justice. She brought files home, names like Brady and Giglio and Franks spoken over spaghetti and bills. Orion had listened until the names became stories, and the stories became maps, and the maps taught him where the ground always gave way. LeClaire rose, papers in hand, voice slipping into the smooth cadence of a man wheeling out a familiar exhibit. "Your Honor, the state will show that the defendant, Orion Vale, was apprehended after fleeing in a 2022 Audi A6 reported stolen that same evening. He attempted to avoid capture, was found near the abandoned vehicle, and left fingerprints on the steering wheel. A clear chain of evidence ties him to the crime." He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The words did the gloating. A chorus of nods rippled through the gallery. Steal a car, run from police, leave fingerprints. Elementary. Judge Kincaid nodded along. Proceed. LeClaire's shoes clicked toward the jury box. The defense might claim coincidence. They may say Mr. Vale was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the simple question defeats those fantasies. What kind of innocent person runs? Orion looked at him and didn't answer. Not yet. There was an answer, and it wasn't short. At the defense table, a public defender named Aisha Mirza stood with careful respect. "Your Honor, my client." Orion touched her sleeve, a quiet request instead of a command. Aisha studied him for half a second, then sat. Trust was sometimes a gamble. She decided to lay a chip on him. Orion faced the bench. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself." The room changed temperature. Silence made itself tall. Deputy Collins raised his eyebrows. "Ms. Park froze above her keys. A reporter uncrossed his legs like that might help him hear better. "You'll what?" Judge Kincaid said, amusement and warning braided together. "I'll defend myself." LeClaire laughed without any humor. "By all means." Orion didn't start with a speech. He asked a question. "Mr. LeClaire, you stated that Sergeant Travis Cole personally witnessed me behind the wheel of the Audi before it was abandoned. Is that correct?" "That is correct," LeClaire replied, head tilted like a man tolerating a child. "His sworn statement is in the record. And that statement reflects the truth." LeClaire's smile was professional. "It reflects what the sergeant observed." "Then there should be no problem," Orion said. verifying Sergeant Cole's GPS and dispatch logs for that time frame. LeClaire didn't answer quickly enough. The pause left a small dent in the veneer. Judge Kincaid laced his fingers. "Mr. LeClaire?" "The state has nothing to hide," LeClaire said, too crisp. "We'll obtain whatever logs the court deems necessary." "Good," Orion said. He didn't bother to look triumphant, because the dispatch tape I obtained through public records shows Sergeant Cole was across town on a separate call when the chase started. If his report says he saw me in the driver's seat, the timing will have to be unusually generous to accommodate reality. The gallery woke up. Judge Kincaid's smirk faded by a degree. LeClaire cleared his throat, tapping the edge of a page that didn't need tapping. "While the state procures that," LeClaire said, pivoting fast, "let's not pretend the case stands on one officer's memory. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel." "My prints," Orion said, "were on the steering wheel." He didn't flinch from it. And if you open with an answer like that, it sounds like the kind of thing only Gil could explain. But the explanation isn't always the confession. He let that sit long enough to become interesting. The car was left idling outside a convenience store that evening. I was there with 3 friends. The door of the Audi was unlocked. I opened it, touched the wheel, and closed it without getting in. It wasn't smart. It was careless. It was also not theft. He turned a fraction toward the jury. If you try on a jacket and put it back, your fingerprints end up on the zipper. If someone steals that jacket an hour later, your fingerprints are still there. Do fingerprints prove ownership or prove touch? Touch is not theft. Curiosity is not a felony. LeClaire's eyes thinned. We don't convict curiosity. We convict facts. Then let's harvest all of them, Orion said. Where's the forensic examiner who processed the steering wheel? LeClaire hesitated. The report is in evidence. And the person who handled the swabs? The person who sealed and transported them? The person who logged them into the lab refrigerator? LeClaire's silence said everything words might have ruined. So the state wants a conviction using a chain of custody we are meant to accept by faith. Orion said quietly. A chain is strong where? At its weakest link. If you can't see the links, you can't see what broke. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The room was leaning in now. Let's take a step back. Orion continued. Who called in the theft? The owner, LeClaire said, regaining ground. Graham Whitmore. Correct, Orion said. And Mr. Whitmore gave a description of the person he saw driving away. LeClaire straightened. The statement says it was dark. It does, Orion said. It says it was dark, and it also says the person was thin, with a light complexion and a buzz cut. I am not thin. I do not have a buzz cut, and I have a complexion that Mr. Whitmore, in the most charitable reading, did not describe. A murmur rippled. Judge Kincaid tapped his pen once. Mr. Vale, keep this to the facts. That is the fact, Orion said. The description did not match me. The car was stolen, then abandoned. I was arrested blocks away walking home with snacks in a plastic bag. The only thing connecting me to the driver is the fact that I touched the wheel before the theft, and that I fit a narrative better than I fit a description. LeClaire lifted a page like a shield. The arresting officer saw the defendant near the vehicle and observed evasive behavior. Evasive behavior is what you call someone's fear when you're sure you know why they're afraid, Orion said. The officer shouted. I stopped. I asked for a lawyer. That was on the body cam until the feed glitched. You're suggesting tampering, LeClaire said, suddenly careful. I'm suggesting a tendency, Orion said. Body cams that cut out are a tendency. Reports written after adrenaline fades are a tendency. Filling gaps with certainty is a tendency. None of these tendencies make guilt true. Enough philosophy, LeClaire said, annoyance leaking in. What makes guilt true are facts, prints, proximity, and a failed attempt to run. And video, Orion said. We should add video. LeClaire blinked. What video? The convenience store had cameras, Orion said. Aisha Ms. Mirza sent a preservation letter the night I was arrested. She didn't have time to pull the footage before today. I did. He set a flash drive on the table and didn't touch it, like it might burn the wrong hands. Judge Kincaid's mouth tightened. This is highly irregular. It's relevant, Orion said, and admissible. It shows who opened the passenger door of the Audi, leaning in for a full 30 seconds, which easily explains a palm print on the passenger side, handle the state hasn't mentioned. It shows who slid into the driver's seat 3 minutes later and drove off. And it shows his face in the light when he pulls his hood down. It is not my face. Leclerc's tongue clicked. Chain of custody for the footage. The store manager will testify, Orion said, and I exported the clip with the system's native hash values intact. You can verify them against the original. You can also cross-reference the timestamp with the automated license plate reader that pinged the Audi at 5th and Lark. The city cameras are public record. I pulled those logs too. Judge Kincaid looked at Leclerc. Mr. Prosecutor? Leclerc's jaw worked. If such footage exists, the state will review it for authenticity. It exists, Orion said, and it sits nicely beside the dispatch timeline. The same timeline that puts Sergeant Cole 2 neighborhoods away when the chase began. Someone in the back laughed once, in shock more than humor. Judge Kincaid's eyes flicked up. Order, Orion breathed, slow and steady. He wasn't a prodigy, not in the cartoon sense. He was a collector of dots who had learned early how to connect them. He was the kid who read transcripts like other kids read comics, who knew the shape of a good question by the way it made a room shift. He didn't enjoy how this felt. He didn't enjoy any of it. He just knew it mattered. Leclerc tried to pull the steering wheel back to his side. The defendant was detained near the abandoned vehicle. He matched the clothing description. No, Orion said. I matched a hoodie. The driver wore a black hoodie. I wore a dark blue one with a stitched crest you can see on the convenience store footage while I'm paying for chips. The driver's hoodie had no crest. The hood strings were white. Mine are navy. Details stop being small when they are all that separate guess from proof. Judge Kincaid sighed in a way that confessed he'd expected this morning to be shorter. We'll recess for 20 minutes. Bailiff, coordinate with IT to view the footage in chambers, and have someone start pulling the dispatch logs. Mr. Leclerc, contact Sergeant Cole. They broke. The gallery exhaled, then inhaled more gossip. Aisha sat, eyes on Orion, like she knew she'd made the right bet, and still couldn't believe her luck. Leclerc made phone calls with his back to the wall, words tight, the kind of conversation meant to push chaos back into a bag. Judge Kincaid disappeared behind a door that turned whispers into wallpaper. Marisol Vale had taken a seat near the aisle. She didn't wave. Orion didn't look over. They'd always been good at reading each other without moving. Her shoulders said the thing she never said out loud. Stay steady. He answered with the thing he always answered. I am. When court reconvened, the room was different in ways that matter more than furniture. The air was heavier. The easy confidence had a scuff mark. Judge Kincaid looked at the bench like it might bite. We viewed the footage, he said. We also obtained initial dispatch records. The state has requested time to reconcile a discrepancy. Leclerc stood, the mask of poise showing its seam. The state acknowledges that Sergeant Cole was not the first unit to respond. His subsequent observation of the defendant near the vehicle was in good faith. In good faith, Orion repeated, not mocking, just putting the words on the table where everyone could see them. That faith is the problem when it replaces facts. Leclerc lifted a hand. The argument here isn't about faith. The defendant's fingerprints remain on the steering wheel. And the technician who collected them isn't here, Orion said. Nor is the officer who handled the gloves after he used his phone, nor the tow driver who reached into the cabin without a protective barrier. If we're going to convict on contact, we are obliged to count every set of hands that might leave residue behind. Judge Kincaid's patience was wearing the way patience does when it wants to be incredulity. Mr. Vale, you're fond of big arguments. Narrow this to your case. Orion's voice softened. I am narrowing it. I'm narrowing it to a car that shows 2 faces on camera. One of them mine before the theft. One of them not mine during the theft. I'm narrowing it to a timeline that places the officer's eyes away from the driver's seat at the critical moment. I'm narrowing it to a description that doesn't fit me. And a chain of custody we're being asked to accept in lieu of testimony. If you narrow much more, you cut out the truth. LeClaire sensed the floor tilting and ran for steadiness. You keep saying you touched the vehicle earlier. Why? Because it was open and I was young, Orion said. Because curiosity and bad judgment are cousins. Because I've touched things I had no right to touch and learned to admit it. But I didn't take what wasn't mine. Then why walk away when officers arrived? LeClaire pressed. I didn't, Orion said. I stopped. I asked for counsel. The body cam dropped out for 27 seconds. I can't tell you what the gaps would show if they didn't exist. Only that the gaps always seem to exist when they would prove the thing everyone is sure cannot be true. Are you accusing officers of lying? I'm accusing the moment of doing the lying, Orion said. Adrenaline lies. Certainty lies. Fear lies. We can stop giving those lies the last word. Judge Kincaid leaned back, weighing the edges. Mr. LeClaire, is the owner of the vehicle available to testify by phone? LeClaire nodded reluctantly. Mr. Whitmore is on standby. Call him. The speakerphone made his voice sound farther than the distance on the line. He confirmed the make and model, the time and the place. The fact that he left the car running to buy cigarettes, he promised himself he'd quit. He said he saw someone slide into the driver's seat and pull away. He said it wasn't the kid on the news. He said the driver was lighter, shaved close on the sides, maybe wearing a ring on his right hand because the light caught it. He said he'd told the officer that. He said the officer told him to stick to the facts and let the process work. He said he had. The room listened harder than rooms usually do. Judge Kincaid ended the call. His eyes settled on the prosecutor. Mr. LeClaire? LeClaire's voice tried for calm and landed on careful. The state requests a continuance to review new evidence and secure the necessary witnesses. And keep my client in custody, Orion said. On the theory that an unknown person with a ring and the wrong haircut committed a crime I'm standing trial for. LeClaire didn't like being backed into simplicity. The state doesn't release defendants because they tell good stories. That's fair, Orion said. We release them when the state's story stops being one. Judge Kincaid rubbed a hand over his mouth. He looked older than he had an hour ago, and also more awake. Motion for continuance is denied. The court finds that the state has failed to meet its burden at this time. The case is dismissed without prejudice. It landed without a gavel. It didn't need one. The words cracked open a sound the ceiling had never learned how to swallow. The gallery broke into a dozen little somersaults of surprise. Someone whispered, "Thank God." Someone else said, "Of course." The reporters remembered how to scribble like they were being paid per verb. Deputy Collins didn't smile, but he looked a fraction less tired. Orion stood there and didn't move right away. He let the decision finish echoing. He let it sink into the walls. He let it become real. Judge Kincaid watched him the way people watch a thing they've misnamed for too long. Something had warmed behind his pupils, regret, or recognition, or the bruised face of a conscience waking up. He cleared his throat. Mr. Vale. Orion stopped at the aisle, turned a degree. You might consider law school, Judge Kincaid said. The sentence did its best to be casual and failed. Orion didn't answer with words. He gave a faint nod that meant more things than it showed. He left the courtroom without dramatic turns. The door closed behind him, and the hallway air hit like a different weather. Reporters waited, microphones like metal flowers wilting toward his mouth. How does it feel? Did you plan the ambush? Are you a prodigy? Did you embarrass the court on purpose? Do you plan to sue? Do you think the system is broken? What are you going to do next? He kept walking. He wasn't interested in answers that became headlines instead of help. On the steps, Marisol Vale waited, arms folded, eyes bright with the kind of relief that knows it will never be full because the world doesn't empty the bucket all at once. For a beat, they just looked at each other. Her shoulders dropped. He smiled, small and true. You scared me, she said. I know, he said. I'm sorry. You won, she said, as if testing whether the word would sit still. We didn't lose, he said. That's what today was. He had wanted to tell her everything he hadn't said. that he'd studied at night, with his ear pressed to the thin classroom wall while a law clinic across the hall prepped motions, the professor's voice becoming a kind of lullaby, that he'd read 100 suppression hearings and memorized the way a question had to be shaped to fit the lock it was meant to open, that he'd taken the LSAT at 16, not because he thought the number would save him, but because he wanted proof that studying wasn't just a way to hide from the parts of life that knocked too hard, that he had mailed a letter to himself every time he felt small, so there would be a postmark for the future to open when it needed a reason to keep going. He didn't say the archive of things piled up behind his ribs. He just stood next to his mother and let the afternoon fall on their shoulders. Across the street, Judge Kincaid stood alone for a moment before his driver pulled up, holding the door like tradition. He didn't get in. He was looking at the steps where Orion stood, like maybe the answer he needed had chosen an inconvenient body. His face had recalibrated. The practiced ease was gone. If pride had been his shield, it had gotten dinged. Inside the courthouse, Damon LeClaire pretended to be busy with logistics, while his reflection in a dark window did the part of the conversation he didn't want anyone else to hear. He knew the footage mattered. He also knew something else was coming. There was always one more thing, and it was usually the thing you didn't respect enough to check. The thing arrived before sunset. It came as a call to a different unit. A patrol officer in another precinct had detained a young man trying to sell a key fob in a pawn shop. The fob belonged to a 2022 Audi A6. The man had a buzz cut. He wore a ring on his right hand that caught the fluorescence like it planned to. He had a bruise on his calf where chain link had grabbed him hard. He had a friend who said he'd borrowed the car and panicked. He had a story that made a mockery of the morning. No one called Orion to tell him. He found out the way people like him find out. 2 days later, in a small paragraph on page 3, below an ad for furniture that would never fit in his apartment. He read it twice, then folded the paper a different way, as if that could change the truth into gratitude. The case never came back. Dismissed without prejudice stayed dismissed without interest. Damon LeClaire did not apologize in public. He called Orion's public defender and left a careful message about new developments and open lines of communication. Ms. Mirza smiled at her desk and didn't return it. Orion went back to the clinic, where he sometimes pretended he was only there to make copies. The professor who ran it, a soft-voiced woman named Elena Rees, who had wrestled more monsters than she could count, looked at him over reading glasses. "You did not do that by yourself," she said. "I didn't," he said. "Ms. Mirza sent the preservation letter." "That," Elena said. "And every trial you've watched in that little brain theater of yours for years. Sit. We have intake forms, and someone in county needs a motion written by morning." "I'm 19, he said. "And yet," she said. He sat. He wrote. He learned the difference between being right and being effective, between winning and keeping a person whole. He learned that the law is a map if you read all the legends, and a maze if you don't. He learned the smell of hope when it finally gets a chance to turn into air. People asked the wrong question. They wanted to know if he was a prodigy. They wanted to know if Judge Kincaid felt embarrassed. They wanted to know if the footage had been a trick. They wanted to know if he planned to become famous. They rarely asked the right one. How many other cases had leaned on the same habits and gotten a different ending because the person sitting at the defense table didn't know where to press? How many times Fingerprints had made men into thieves because the state forgot to count all the hands? How many times a body cam's missing half-minute had carried more weight than the 50 minutes that existed? How often a description had drifted away from a person and landed on a stereotype with better aim? Orion didn't have numbers. He had faces. He had a library of small mistakes that turned into large punishments. He had a story that had ended well and a memory that would never let him call it a happy ending without an asterisk. He had a mother who kept her bills folded by due date and who laughed more loudly now if something was actually funny. He had a judge who had to look in the mirror and decide whether to become someone different than the man who had smirked at a teenager and a clock. He applied to law school. He took the same stubbornness that had kept his voice level in a room designed to flatten it and poured it into pages. He wrote about the gaps that keep showing up whenever someone needs the truth most. He wrote about how power tells stories and how the wrong story, told with enough practice, ruins a life. He wrote about Ms. Mirza and Elena Ruiz and the nameless clerk who stamped his public records request at 10 minutes before closing and changed everything. When the acceptance came, he didn't whoop. He pressed the letter to the table and thought about breath. He thought about how he had learned to take it carefully so it lasted long enough to get out of the building. He thought about how many people never learn that trick because they don't get the time. He thought about walking back into a courtroom and choosing which side of the table to stand on. He went back to Kincaid's courtroom once, not for a case, but for a reason he couldn't explain to most people without sounding ungrateful. He wanted to see if anything had moved. The judge was on the bench, hearing a probation violation that looked like a trap disguised as an opportunity. Kincaid asked the right question before anyone prompted him, whether the defendant understood the conditions fully when he signed them, whether the terms had been explained, whether anyone had bothered to confirm comprehension instead of assuming it. He asked to see the paperwork no one ever looked at. He asked for someone to find the supervisor in charge of a program that punished people for missing a check-in when the bus never arrived. Orion watched quietly, had bowed just enough to pass for a law student taking notes. When the hearing ended, he stood and left without speaking. He didn't want a moment. He wanted a system that, on some days, wanted to be better than the people who built it. He became the person strangers sent cousins to when the cousin had been caught up in a way that made family dinners feel brittle. He learned to say no to cases he wasn't right for and learned to pass those names to people who were better at that kind of fight. He promised himself something that sounded like a vow, but was really a habit. He would never call the machine a monster, because monsters make us feel powerless, and he could not do this work if he loved powerlessness more than he loved stubbornness. Years later, on a morning so ordinary it pretended to be unimportant, he ran into Judge Kincaid in a lobby neither of them owned. Kincaid had more gray in his hair and fewer jokes in his pockets. They shook hands for the first time. "I was wrong," Kincaid said, not theatrically, not dragging the word out to make it count for more. "I don't mean about you. I mean about the shape of the room. I built it to make quick sense. Quick sense is lazy." "I'm still learning," Orion said. "Good," Kincaid said. "Stay that way. Our profession has too many experts who learned how to congratulate themselves." They parted without promise or performance. Two people who had survived a story that wasn't supposed to belong to either of them. There were days after that when Orion lost. The losses carved him hollow in places, and he learned not to fill those hollows with arrogance or despair. He learned to let the empty be honest. He learned to read transcripts in the evening without believing the sentences would rearrange themselves to be kinder. He learned to keep asking for the footage, the logs, the chain, the link, the tiny thing that looks too small to be the difference, but always is. When someone asked him to tell his story, he told this version, the one where a judge mocked a teenager and then learned what the teenager already knew, that the truth is a long road made of small stones, and you walk it by paying attention, not by knowing the destination. He left out the cameras and the microphones and the way strangers wanted to make him into an emblem. He left in the names of the people who had handed him maps when he was still deciding if he deserved to use them. He left in the part where he touched a car he shouldn't have touched and learned to say so without also saying it made him a thief. People always wanted a good ending. He gave them an accurate one instead. The case was dismissed. The thief was found. The system was the same in most rooms and better in a few. A mother slept through the night sometimes. A judge asked better questions. A boy grew into a voice he had kept quiet for too long. And somewhere, in a courtroom on an afternoon that will not make the papers, a hand will rise with a request that sounds like an interruption and turns out to be the first true sentence anyone speaks that day. When that happens, someone will roll their eyes, and someone will smile, and someone will feel the heavy air tilt. They won't know why. They won't know it is because a teenager once refused to be the easy story and forced a room to learn a harder lesson. Touch is not theft. Doubt is not disrespect. Evidence is not a rumor. And the truth is not a favor that power does for the patient.